A British diplomat has finally quit over Gaza. Mark Smith resigned last week in protest at the UK continuing to sell weapons to Israel. Joining me to discuss this story is the former British soldier, Joe Glenton.
Hello, mate. Thanks for having me on.
Joe, I'm really glad that we can talk about this story together because you served in Afghanistan and were thrown in jail in 2010 for protesting against that disastrous war. How did you feel when you heard that another insider had publicly objected to British foreign policy, in this case, arms sales to Israel?
Well, I think first of all, you have to commend the individual, as you always do in these cases. It seems to me, reading around it, that he was particularly involved with the arms, the kind of arms side of it, monitoring arms, the nature of arms, and where they were going. So he's obviously very close to it, and I suggest he's a pretty well informed individual. It's often the case. It's often the case when people do things like this that the Foreign Office or whichever department, or generally people who resist the public knowing things, kind of write them up as relatively junior figures who don't really matter. And that's particularly the case with military personnel who do it. This person seems to be relatively senior and must have been highly informed. So he's obviously doing this from a position of knowledge. So it's very impressive. But of course, there is a broader question about why it's a trickle. There has been a trickle over the last 20 years of people resigning, people resisting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Yemen, and other places as well. But we always have to ask why they're so few, commendable though it is.
Let's listen to what Mark Smith told BBC Radio 4 on Monday about his reasons for resigning.
My profession, or former profession, as of last week, was to advise the government on the legality of arms sales. And when you look at what constitutes a war crime, it's actually quite clear, even from what you see in open source on the TV, that the state of Israel is perpetrating war crimes in plain sight.
One thing that strikes me is that his decision wasn't based on any secret intelligence he saw at the Foreign Office or recent revelations like the torture of Palestinian detainees. Why do you feel it's taken him 10 months to blow the whistle? Was he perhaps waiting to see if Labour would suspend arms exports?
It could well have been the case because I think it looked like the Tories were on their way out quite a while ago. To be honest, they could have been making that calculation. I think we also have to talk about there are many different kinds of friction on people, on insiders, which stop them coming forward. I mean, if you were to look at it in a kind of materialist way, if you're a low-ranking soldier and you're thinking about your pension and your job, I think there are other things beyond that. There's official secrets, there's a potential for prosecution, and those affect different people, diplomats and military personnel, differently.
Army officers and diplomats get paid a lot more than you were earning in the military as a lance corporal. So there's even more incentives for them not to rock the boat. And one of the perks of those higher ranking roles is that the government often pays for their children to go to private schools if the parents are stationed abroad. Of course, we don't know what Mark Smith's personal circumstances were, and he's taken an incredibly brave step to resign in the way that he has done. And some people now will probably try and discredit him. I've seen some people saying, well, he was posted to the British Embassy in Dublin. That doesn't seem very relevant to the war in Gaza. But I understand that he was previously posted in Egypt, and he wrote the government's main assessment on the legality of selling weapons to the Middle East. So I think he does have quite serious expertise on this matter that will have made the Foreign Office quite nervous that he is now resigned in this manner. Joe, what sort of impact do you think resignations like his can have on particularly government ministers such as David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary?
It's always difficult to assess because they're not going to let you know the impacts it had. I hope, and I would suggest, it's a pretty serious. This is someone in a high up in a relatively senior diplomat doing a job that's very close to the conduct. It's very, very closely related to the conduct of Israel's war in Gaza. But it's always difficult to say. Uh, yeah, I mean, I had Gordon Brown, who's generally seen as at least a liberal figure, sometimes even a fairly left-wing one, and certainly Starmer early on framed himself as that when he was running for the leadership. But I think we know. I think if you none of it's obscure that Starmer's very committed to Israel. He's absolutely committed to continuing a kinetic and violent British foreign policy. But yeah, it's difficult to know what kind of conversations and what kind of damage control measures and so on will be put in place.
Mark Smith is the first British diplomat to publicly resign over Israel, but he is not the first Western official by any means. 5 US State Department figures have also quit, including some very senior personnel. In the UK, are there others like yourself, Joe, and Mark Smith, who have protested against UK foreign policy over the years?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, a very prominent one is Ben Griffin, who is ex Second Battalion Parachute Regiment and SAS, a super soldier, very good at what he did, and he blew the whistle on rendition and was subsequently dragged into a court in the wee hours of the night, I seem to recall, and gagged with a 50 grand fine. He's one example. More recently, there's been the Lance Corporal Albertati, who was a British soldier in signals. I think he was in signals intelligence from memory. Who was from a Yemeni background, who did a very, very brave individual protest in Downing Street, and he was eventually discharged. But of course, it's important we talk about the kind of material breaks which stop people doing these things, but it's also the cultural stuff, which is kind of what you're referring to there. Whereas when you are an insider and you're kind of in the gang, to be in that gang, you have to have been, I don't want to say brainwashed because it's not nuanced enough, but indoctrinated, socialized to be in that environment. And there are all kinds of cultural breaks. The military, and I would suggest the intelligence services and probably the Foreign Office, have this kind of keep it in house, complain in house maybe, but don't go outside it. And I think that's what makes individuals like Ben and like this gentleman and like Lance Corporal Albertati so significant, because they're people who go against that. And you could also extend that to people like Snowden and Chelsea Manning. There's something about those individuals and the context and the way that the experience of conflict and being kind of at the coalface of conflict to some degree, and seeing it laid out in front of you affects them and makes them turn rogue, in effect, makes them shrug off this kind of socialization that they've gone through and turn against the system which they had previously been a part of.
Earlier this year, Declassified revealed that hundreds of civil servants at the Foreign Office had signed a letter in protest at the UK's policy on Israel. We then followed up this story with a Freedom of Information request and found that less than 5 of them had actually formally registered their concerns via the department's internal whistleblower channel. Mark Smith was clearly one of them, and he told Radio 4 that he was disappointed with the outcome of that process, hence his decision to resign publicly. We've asked him for an interview but haven't managed to get one yet. But let's take a look back at another Foreign Office whistleblower who we interviewed in 2020 about arms sales to Saudi Arabia during the war in Yemen and her concerns about what was going on.
Boris Johnson was very casual and jokey when we would go in to talk to him about arms to Saudi Arabia. We would go in to brief him about Yemen, and he would just joke around and waste everybody's time. And it was a bit mind-blowing, because it was, you're discussing civilian casualties, you're discussing the fact that innocent people have died and that British supplied bombs have played a part in that.
So that was Molly Mulready there. Joe, can you tell us more about some of these other fascinating insiders who've blown the whistle on UK foreign policy in recent times?
Yeah, so there are other examples. Catherine Gunn, Ken Ross, another particularly impressive example, and Craig Murray, who's also a UK diplomat. So these people do crop up, and I think there's a question here about how we support them, whether as journalists or particularly if they're connected to kinetic foreign policy stuff, if they're military and so on. Veterans for Peace, part of the role of which the now defunct UK anti-war ex-forces organisation, part of their role was to support resistors and objectors, and they've gone now. So I think there's a question about how we support these people and how we make it easier for people to do this, because I think we will see more of them, especially given the risks they may face of prosecution and so on, if people feel they are supported properly and there's a space for them to say what they have to say. And I think that's something which we need to work on. We need to make sure they feel they can do that and that they will be supported. And I think certainly my personal experience is that I was massively supported, and most of the other veterans who resisted, who went through some kind of process of conscientious objection or public resistance, found they had huge support. But we need to make sure people who are insiders know that they will be supported. This diplomat who's just resigned because he was so close to the coalface, he was working on arms assessments. I think that makes his case particularly significant, which is not to diminish the others, but I just think in this moment that he's in an incredibly important position, and what he's done is particularly brave.
Well, thanks, Joe, for joining us this morning. And I know you're writing an article for us soon as well, so people can check that out on Declassified UK when it comes out. We haven't been making many videos this month, but starting to get back into it now again. So if you haven't already subscribed, please click the button below and share the video. Thanks for watching.